Closed captioning for the professors is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury and wrongful death law firm in Chicago.
A recent study finds many colleges and universities are dropping the ball when it comes to spending on academics and instead pouring buckets of money into athletics. In some cases, spending 6 to 12 times more per athlete compared to the average student. Should we be concerned about that trend? That's coming up next on today's edition of The Professors. Joining us to talk about spending on academics versus athletics are Michael Crenshaw, professor at Daly College, Pamela Cannon-Moray, professor at Kennedy King College, William Settles, retired professor from Truman College, and Dr. Nick Panomitros, attorney and professor at Kennedy King College. Welcome all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so athletic programs. This isn't new. Colleges have always spent money on athletic programs. Why is all of a sudden it's a concern?
I think it's just extremely overboard with the entitlement that I think the students feel when they come into the classroom.
Really?
Yes.
All right, so before they get into the classroom, let's talk about the money that they spend. So we're saying 6 to 12 times more on an athlete than the actual student. I mean, it's not right. You know, I always tell I always say it's not rocket science, but it's science, right? Mm-hmm. So it's math. They make more money.
Right.
So, of course, they're going to invest more in the athletic programs because that's where they can get a quick return for their dollar, yes or no?
Well, of course.
The problem is that the numbers in themselves don't indicate a lot. Mm-hmm. I mean, your first question was, why is it an issue? Well, obviously, the cost of education is making people unhappy.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's steadily increasing.
Yes, and at the same time, the resources going into public education, at least through the states, is diminishing, and so there's this pressure to fund standard education programs. But the question is not really, you know, how much more is being spent on the athletes, but is the amount being spent per student in general adequate? And are universities, in fact, depriving their students of some resources in order to fund athletics, or is it simply that they're just spending money on athletics above and beyond what is required?
Now, just so we're perfectly clear, we're making sure we're talking about college and university athletic programs.
Yes.
So we're not talking about public schools
Sure.
or anything of that nature. So we're just talking post-secondary, correct?
Yeah. But most of these institutions that are under scrutiny are public institutions.
Well,
and they are the largest institutions in the athletic conferences, and thus they're under the spotlight.
Well, I know Michael and I, we're a product of Big Ten.
Right.
You know, from University of Illinois down in Champaign. Are any of you guys products of?
Yeah.
Well, I went to Northern Illinois University, and now they're very popular.
Oh, they certainly are.
But at the time, they were not.
With the
But
Huskies.
The
yeah.
Huskies,
Well,
yes.
yeah.
My question is this, or let me say this first, and then my question. You know, right now the times are hard, so budgets are tight, but money has been spent. There's always been money appropriated for these things in the past. So right now it's come to, I guess, the attention of the public. But if you don't fund these programs, then you're not going to have a football team. You're not going to have, homecoming. You're not going to have all these different events. So, do we want to do away with that, or are we going to work with less money for those programs?
Well, no. Well, you're not going to do away with it because athletics. It makes so much money now. I mean, you look at all the money that college football and college basketball bring in.
Well, there's a greater profit margin.
Right, it's a definite. So of course they are going to definitely invest more in the athlete because the athletes bring in so much return on that investment. And I disagree. I don't think that they necessarily ignore the academic part of this because a lot of the money that these schools make from athletics, they go towards that new English building. They go towards that new chemistry building. They go towards that new biology building. So
well, in some cases that's true. I think the studies that...
But it doesn't go to reduce tuition.
Oh, of course not.
Okay.
No, of course not.
So it still goes through the institution's infrastructure. So it doesn't.
But tuitions may not go up as much because of that, which is
I don't know. I looked at
same.
UIC. The tuition jumped surprisingly high. I was surprised at how high
but
it is.
But are we doing a disservice to that student athlete?
Okay, so Pamela, we want to talk about the student athlete because let's talk about that then. So these schools, they spend more money on the athlete than they actually do on the student. So what does the athlete get out of it?
The athlete, depending on depending on whether you agree with it or not, the athlete allegedly gets a free ride through college, allegedly, and the athlete.
Why you keep saying allegedly?
Because there's this notion that a lot of the public has, that athletes have a free ride for 4 years, which is not true. Fact of the matter is, you get one scholarship per year, and at the end of that scholarship, if you do not have a 2.0, you lose that scholarship. If you are not playing well, you lose that scholarship. And so there's nothing free about it, because it's like a trade. You know, you give me something, I give you something.
Okay.
So, you know, a lot of people would have you believe that the athlete not only is getting a free ride through college for 4 years, but that athlete also has an opportunity to go pro, which also is not a guarantee. Because if we all know, if you tear up your knee, you tear up your elbow, you get injured, then there's a very good chance that you won't go pro. And what a lot of people don't understand when it comes to the scholarships, that if you get injured, especially if you're a second string wide receiver, for instance,
It's a wrap.
it's over for you.
Yeah.
It's over. And so that's why I say, in terms of the public, they think that athletes get all of this special treatment, and you know, they just basically have a free ride. But when in all actuality, that's not the case.
Well, I think the public tone has changed a little bit as far as those such broad assumptions, especially seeing incidents of other college athletes that we know that have been injured, and now to find out that even though they're in the hospital recovering, that they lose their scholarship, and you know, and have people to actually appeal to the school's board of trustees and say you need to restore the scholarship, which to me, as a parent, I have 3 boys, 1 girl, and I am as this mother. In my house, I don't put academics over athletics. You know, so one condition that I have is that, you know, I know at some point somebody's going to be chasing after one of my kids to give them an athletic scholarship, but there are some of us parents who say, no, it will not be an athletic scholarship. It will be an academic scholarship, and then you can play on the team. Because you're right, the moment that you are injured and you can no longer serve the college in that capacity, you lose that scholarship. So that's why it's important to ensure it is an academic scholarship and not just an athletic scholarship.
But see, it's easy to say that until that recruiter hits your house.
No, it is not easy to say. It is easy for me to say that because as a parent, I have certain academic standards. I'm not going to let my child float through my house with less than a C.
But what happens, and just to play devil's advocate here, what happens when your son leaves your home, goes to a Big Ten or SEC type school, far away from you, you're not there, the coach, the recruiter, you know, the athletic director is pumping this kid's head with, you're great, keep playing well. Hadn't mentioned academics yet. You know, and this happens to a lot of kids where, yes, the parent at home is saying... But
Michael, you didn't hear me. What I said is that before they leave my house, and if they're offered a scholarship to play on any athletic program, I'm fine with that. But it has to be an academic scholarship, not just an athletic scholarship. So then that way, when you bust your knee, God forbid, you're not immediately told, well, by next semester, you need to be out the dorm.
But what if they only offer an athletic scholarship? And what if that kid...
Michael, don't go there.
I'm just saying that this. I mean, I've been recruited. I understand. What if the coach says, all we can do is offer you an athletic scholarship? That's all we can
do. And as a parent, I would say thanks, but no thanks.
Wow, that's tough. Because that's...
Well, I don't think that is tough. I think a lot of times those decisions, you have to be careful. People are chasing the money. And when they chase the money, then they start ruling out other variables.
Athletics.
I don't think there's anything wrong with athletic programs. But what I'm saying is that, you know, now I sound like my dad. You know, my dad was a preacher, so he would always say, as for me and my house. As for me and my house, it's not just an athletic scholarship. I don't care if he can run like the wind or she. It has to be an academic scholarship.
The unique thing about athletics, I mean, if we listen to ourselves, is that it is an athletic scholarship or an athletic participation is predicated on a certain set of assumptions about the future, about future earnings, and also it's part of a system of preparation for a professional career that a student athlete may not ever have. That was the point Michael was making. I was thinking analogously, if you had a child who was not so interested in the academics, you know, traditional academics, but was very, very talented, prodigiously talented in music or in the visual arts. And that was where your child would excel, and it was on, and their award would be to a conservatory or an art institute, or school like that. What would be your feeling? I think sports tends, because it is so, one, risky, and second is the structure of college sports as a money-making system for everybody,
except the
athletes, who then have no voice, and who, unfortunately, because people who over-specialize tend to be very narrow, don't see the big picture as much as other people might, parents notwithstanding. So what do we do? On one hand, I think the problem about the institutions over investment or over appreciation of sport versus academics, I think that's overblown. I don't really see that these, even the Division I big institutions that are the big players in college sports, they're also the ones who produce the most Nobel Prize winners. You know, so are they diminishing the importance of academics? I don't think so. But the problem seems to be that you've got this system that is making money, and that becomes all important, and it's so embedded in our culture. It's what we do with our leisure. It is a form of entertainment. It is a form of employment for thousands and thousands of people who are not the athletes, but just are peripheral. And one of the issues that was raised in one of the articles that we have is, should we not change the system so that we acknowledge that the student athlete, unlike every other student, is part of the money-making apparatus of the institution and of the larger industry, and compensate them differently, and I would push, educate them differently.
What do you mean by educate them differently?
I think that the way the system is designed, it is foolish to expect the same allocation of time, the same interest, and to be quite honest, the same level of academic skill across the board for students who have really come to major in sport, as opposed to those who came to major in, I don't know, partying or whatever else, but who have been deemed to be academically qualified. You know, we're talking about often fairly selective institutions, these flagship state universities. They don't let everybody in who applies.
But if we're talking about academics or the above average student, usually the student athletes are the ones who excel both academically and as well in their sport. And so that's the perception. So if the perception is that because now it sounds like you're saying that to educate them differently, we're not to have the same expectation that they will do well in a class, in English 101, that an English major would have.
But they will always have problems, because the amount of time that's necessary for them to be training, especially during season, the reality of it is there's just not enough time in a day, and so sometimes there has to be made accommodations. Going to something a little bit tangential to what you're talking about, you know, you go back to ancient Greece, you know, these philosophers, yet these states, these Greek states would war, but for the Olympic Games, would put it down because of the philosophy, healthy mind, healthy body. And our universities or our colleges are, I think, something of the same sort. The only thing is the quagmire, the difficulty here is appropriating funds, and is it fair for the athlete to be given, you know, special status, or, you know, be given a break. But I think going back to what you were saying earlier, if the school is making it back, you know, via tickets, selling whatever it is, more tickets to the game, then at the end of the day, they're really actually producing something for the school.
Yeah, they are, but they're not getting their fair share. I mean, just because they get, you know, an extra grand on their meal card a semester, and just because they get to stay in the dorm, quote unquote, for free, right? I mean, that's nothing, that's peanuts compared to exactly what the college or what that university or that institution makes. Because you got to remember, it's a whole enterprise. It's not just going to the game, it's the selling of the jerseys. One of the things that opened my eyes were the video games. They're actually selling their images without their permission and making money. Those students should be compensated. I'm an advocate that those students should be compensated for that. Not immediately like you get a paycheck every 2 weeks, but I do believe the money should be put in.
But then, hang on a second, then it's the same thing that goes for the people in research that are you know, working in the labs and working on something, and later on the school or the professor is able to patent the product, or they're writing a paper or writing a book, and the students are participating. They don't get a cut in it. All they do is they get a break on their tuition, and that's it. They don't get to take a cut of it. So I think it's very similar to the people in research.
Maybe they should.
Well, we have to overhaul the whole system. Then, you know.
But I will say though, I will say though that in terms of the video games, the Ed O'Bannon case, they've stopped that. You know, that they're not getting their likeness placed on games, and so
that's where I'm going, right?
They at least stopped that.
But isn't that hard? But they would rather give that up than actually compensate them. But that's, to me, that's the conversation I walked away. I was like, wow, so you'd rather just burn down the whole village rather than put up a new apartment, compensate them rather than compensate them, or set up some type of compensation system, whether it's, you know, put the money in a trust fund and you get a little, you know, kickback every 2 weeks, whatever case would be. You would rather just dismantle that idea altogether.
But there's a lot of, I agree with you, but you'd be amazed.
You hear that, Nick? He agrees with me.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree. But you'd be amazed at the pushback. You know, whenever I bring this up around my colleagues in terms of college athletes getting some type of compensation, some type of pay, and figuring out an actual structure where it's fair for everyone, I'm the minority in that argument.
What's the argument against your position?
The argument, they get a free scholarship, they get a free ride through college. Well, why should they get any money? Their money is in the education. That's the argument that gets thrown back in my face, as well as a lot of other people's faces who are in support of these athletes getting money. I hear it all the time. And of course, I don't agree with that.
I think it just calls for you know, parents. It just calls for parents to be a little bit more involved in paying a little bit more attention. And I don't think I think yes, there are athletes who are not academically proficient. I get that. But I think that at home a certain standard needs to be held.
Well, what about the athletes that maybe do 1 year of college and then they're drafted?
Right, the NBA.
But see, at that point, they're an adult. You know, I'm going to be honest with you. If that's what my kid does, that's what my son or daughter does, and at that point, then that onus is on them. It really is. That onus is on them. They've made that choice, and they've made that choice. But I'm just talking about my responsibility as a parent from the moment that you cross the stage in high school and you're on your way to college. I'm still responsible for that conversation in some kind of way.
But what about the college education? Because now they don't have that. They're professional now, and if they get injured, now what? So the same thing happens. So
but then someone will say, well, that's all the propensity of a free market. I mean, there's nothing in the NBA rule handbook that says that, hey, Nick, you're such a great college athlete. I'm going to draft you your sophomore year. There's nothing in the NBA rule book that says, and by the way, because you're so underage, because I'm pulling you from the college program, you are required to finish this bachelor degree program.
Well, what you need to really change it, and we were kicking this around, you need a Curt Flood or 3 and a Marvin Miller. You basically need some really good athletes to stand up and say, we demand. You know, there was a term that used when I was coming up. We used to use, we make demands on.
I know people are afraid to use the word demand these days.
Yes, I know, but we demand. John Carlos in the Black Glove. We demand. Curt Flood saying, I'm not going to be treated like a slave. But you need also the legal people who are willing, pro bono if necessary, to stand behind these kids. You need, in fact, a pro bono legal system to follow kids home, to sit with them and their mom when that recruiter comes.
Exactly, and that's the, I guess we all are beating the same tambourine, because I'm saying the conversation, it starts with the parents. I mean, the parents need to be part of this conversation, but they need to be educated as opposed to just saying, oh, my baby going off to be an athlete, oh, he's a star now.
Yeah, but again, to play devil's advocate, I agree with you, that's what you do. But a lot of parents, unfortunately, see that kid as that ticket out of that bad neighborhood.
I think that is a broad assumption based on a few movies.
No.
And I don't think all parents are like that.
I didn't say all. I didn't say all. I said some. There are some parents who say, hey, look, you know what? You are my ticket out. Perfect example. Take a look at Derrick Rose. Look at how his family was all around him. They manage everything that kid does. From the time that kid went to Simeon, to Memphis, to the NBA with the Bulls. I mean, even today, his brother is his mouthpiece.
But
that kid is managed.
But see, the thing is in the backdrop conversation, the elephant in the room that needs to be brought into the tent is that there's this gross assumption that because they are so athletically gifted, then they must be suffering academically.
Well,
so are you saying that he wasn't?
We're not saying that.
Okay.
We're saying
Let me give you a contrary example. Okay. If you look at some of the, and I won't name names, but certain athletic Olympic medal winners in certain events that require you to spend time in water. Superstar, but don't let that person open their mouth. Okay? Why? Because of over-specialization in the one thing and ignoring everything else in life. And so what you find is that, it doesn't start with getting ready to go to college, it started with grade school.
That's true. I mean, they don't even offer endorsements to athletes that can't speak well.
Right, but then again, what I'm saying is, well, yeah, one guy did get endorsements and the other one got a lot of pictures taken. In terms of the two guys I'm talking, the Olympic athlete. But what I'm saying is people who tend to be very narrow and over-specialized just don't always, and why do we expect it? Why do we expect that the person who can write excellent novels can also play a sport well? We don't. Right. So I'm just...
Touche. Okay.
And that's part of the reason why sports are in these universities or in colleges. It's because of exactly what you're talking about. Because how many people in college that don't partake of sports, that go on to get a master's and a PhD and physically decay by the time they're 30 because they don't feel it's important.
Well, they learn to drink beer in college, and that's by 30. That's what you see.
I didn't learn to drink beer in college.
And so it's important for the balance, and I think that's the whole concept of having sports in universities.
Yeah, but see, here's the thing. I mean, the origin of all this stuff, including the myths about the Greek athletes, because they were pros getting paid during the Olympic Games as well. But
my point was that they dropped everything for that because of its importance.
But the idea of the amateur, if you simply replace that with the term gentleman, what it really meant was the elite sector of the society who could go to college, right, and who didn't need to earn money. And basically, if you follow the history of American, there's a nice program about this, the history of sports in American colleges. It was to calm down these students who were as raucous. There were a bunch of men, young men, who were as raucous as anybody you'd see today. They started fights and fires and acted crazy. And trying to civilize them, they brought in sports. Now, they did not need to, they had no professional sports because it was what gentlemen did. And a gentleman was an amateur. He did it for the love of the sport. Now, that all changed toward the end of the century. You have professional sports from the working class, interestingly. So it's a class thing. And now what we're doing is imposing.
It's definitely a class issue.
Well,
You're correct about that.
And look at it. Look at the division of sports by class. Two of the sports that appeal to the working class have training camps and minor leagues. You don't have to get a college degree. and pretend to have a college education. Two of the sports which come out of an elite background in colleges, you can't get into them almost, you know, LeBron being the wonderful exception, without going through this system of minor leagues
about hockey and baseball. You can be recruited out of high school.
Right out of high school, out of the minor leagues. They pay, soccer too. They pay you to learn the game if you've demonstrated talent all the way through your secondary school. And this whole interesting class system, except the class is now, instead of gentlemen, they're exploited working class kids.
Well, there is, and that's a wonderful way to round robin the conversation, because there is a lot of exploitation that goes on. And I think the main question for us at the beginning of the conversation is that is it inappropriate for colleges and universities to disproportionately spend their dollar on how much do they spend on an athlete as opposed to how much do they spend on the student. So I'll let you have the last word because time is winding down, but when we have our after conversation, we're definitely going to dig into that. So what did you want to say,
Well, I'm
Bill?
just saying, you know, one of the things we forget is how we count per student expenditures. The exercise equipment, which is very, very, very expensive, gets counted in as an expenditure for the athlete. Just in the same way that the high-tech physical monitoring equipment in biometric studies gets counted into how you educate a student in neuroscience, you know? And if you look at even how we count what it costs to educate a student here, we spend more on science and nursing and allied health than we do on liberal arts. It's simply that you count the building, you count the equipment, you count the technology, and so what directly impacts the student just comes to a direct service is probably a very small part of that, but the whole infrastructure that you need to educate or to provide for the athlete versus providing for the English major just turns out to be radically different. So when you average things out, you have to look, you know, and it's the arcane stuff that college administrators have to live with, and I happen to learn a little bit about
All right,
that.
well, then let's talk a little bit more about that in the after show. So that's our show for today. The conversation continues online at WYCC.org. See you next time on The Professors.